I'm just gonna come out and say this now. Full disclosure and all that. And despite my saying this, it is not an invitation to dismiss every objective critique that I say as a personal bias. I'm still gonna look at this game as a game, same as I always do. But this needs to be said anyway because, well, I'm gonna get accused of it whether or not I do say it, and there's no need for your speculation. I have no love left for Square Enix or the Final Fantasy franchise. Yeah, can I finish before we start with this? I'll admit, I was a major fan of the franchise. The first game I had pre-ordered was the very polarizing Final Fantasy VIII, but it did leave a sour taste in my mouth after I'd played it. I got into 7 far after its initial popularity in 1997. I legitly enjoyed 10, and 9 is my overall favorite of the entire series. Everything past 10, though, had felt odd. I'll admit I was put off by the announcement that 11, a main series game, was going to be an MMO. It seemed like an odd choice, but my love of the series didn't stop me from making that the first MMO I'd ever played. But as of late, the series seems to be driven by a team that seems more than willing to ignore the fantasy part of their title, with an art director who's going for the world record of how many belts can fit on a human torso, and a story director who's so obsessed with his original character Do Not Steal that he's forced us to deal with 2 sequels to the one Final Fantasy game that's nigh universally despised. The fact that Square was making another MMO as a main series game put me off even further. They already had one. Most shockingly, the game was utterly rejected upon its initial release, going into a sort of de facto buy-to-play status and removing most of its original staff, then retooling the game entirely and giving it a subtitle. The only thing more surprising was when the game was so fervently welcomed back after such a debacle. So it's high time I find that out for myself. This is the MMO Grinder, and it's time to look at Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV, also known as Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, is a 3D fantasy world MMO, set in the world of Eorzea and taking place after a great cataclysm that destroyed and reshaped the world, which was caused by Bahamut as far as the in-game story is concerned, but comes across as this hilarious cover-up concerning this game's abysmal launch and forced reset, now referred to by the players as version 1 or 1.0. Why was I so unwilling to look at this game? Because I know my audience, and I guarantee most of you listening to this right now aren't here to watch MMO Grinder. You're here to watch a video about Final Fantasy XIV. Notepad handy, ready to pause the video every 5 seconds to comment on something I said. I'm fully expecting this. I couldn't even joke on Twitter about how the honeymoon period fervor for this game was inevitably going to wear off, without a night of harassment that ended up with me having to block 2 people. Zealotry doesn't even begin to describe this perfect storm of final fanaticism and first MMO syndrome. In fact, my questions of why this game was apparently so much better than the botched original version was always met with the same responses. The graphics are good. The combat is better. Empty, meaningless statements with no context. It wasn't until Grindstone member Chatra left a comment on my site that I saw anyone explain what they liked about the game to any reasonable capacity. Fast forward to a few months ago, I see the game picking up even more among my friends, and when raid leader patron Sabin requested the title, that pretty much cemented my interest in the game. So it's time to see if this curiosity is paid off and this inevitable aftermath will be worth it. This likely won't come as a shock to anyone, but this game is gorgeous. It's exactly what you'd expect from the series' graphical pedigree, and in that department it certainly doesn't disappoint. There's amazing lighting effects involving lens flares and beams of light traveling through crevices and rocks and buildings. The amazing part of all this is that the game doesn't seem to tank your system as a trade-off. I never really noticed any major issues with slowdown, even in larger groups and more populated areas. Not even main towns would cause this game to chug, but to be fair, my server wasn't the most populated of the choices, but I've seen far worse frame rate issues in games with far less people in them. One of the most impressive things that I noticed that most others haven't seemed to have noticed is that your character's armor can get wet, most noticeable when walking through shallow waters with a robe on, as the bottom of the robe will appear shiny and slowly go back to match the rest of it. If it happens to be raining during one of these game's amazing looking weather effects, this wetness effect will happen to your entire outfit. It's easily missed, but color me impressed. The enemy design is imaginative as hell, including some of the more familiar Final Fantasy staples like the Adamantoise and the Malboro, the latter oddly referred to in this game as Morbles. Taking a close look at many of the enemies reveals some stunning level of character modeling and detail. Remember the first time you saw a sandworm in Final Fantasy X? I get that feeling with nearly every non-humanoid enemy in this game when I stop to take a close look at them. The overall feel of the game works, and while the game is an exact reflection of the graphical standard, or even the setting of the latest games in the series, it's a much more delightful back-to-fantasy approach that the series has been sorely lacking. Ready for another obvious shocker? This game has utterly amazing music. Not all the tracks stick with me, mind you, and there's been plenty of times where Grindstone had to lay witness to me singing different songs over the Old Day theme and the Dungeon Fight theme in Totoroc, because they reminded me too much of other songs. Check the comment section on my site if you want to know which songs. I'm not mentioning them here. There are plenty of familiar and well-orchestrated versions of classic tracks by Nobuo Uematsu, as well as original tracks featuring heavy guitar and lyrics as well. Each area plays a slightly different variant on the battle theme, and dynamic events and boss fights all feature their own themes. The PvP theme, also used for some bosses, is an amazingly intense version of the classic Crystal theme. Many times I ended up passing a dynamic event and go, I don't have time for this, and then all of a sudden this music would kick in, and I'd be like, I could stick around for a bit. That's almost a lot of the reason this game likely has a very fervent fanbase. The nostalgia bombing is intense, and the soundtrack is at the forefront of this. I got a lot more of a clue as to why this game was so fervently loved when I watched a stream of the game and the streamer mounted up on a chocobo, and the chocobo theme started to play. That's actually one of several versions of the chocobo theme in the game. The game rewards you with blaring fanfare upon obtaining and completing a quest. That iconic Final Fantasy victory fanfare? It plays all the time. Level up, Final Fantasy victory music. Complete a dynamic event? Final Fantasy victory music. Complete an instance? Final Fantasy victory music. Go to sleep? Final Fantasy victory music. No, I am not making a joke there. As the sound design goes, it's unique, but pales in comparison to the music. The sounds of battles aren't nearly as flashy as the sights of battle, and for the most part they might go ignored. Nothing about it stood out, but at least it didn't rely on any stock sound effects. There's voice acting in this game, but it's a seriously mixed bag. Due to a localization choice that I will definitely have words for later, many of the voice actors read their lines in this over-pronounced faux British accent, and it comes across as mediocre.
I leave Lady Lilira in your capable hands.
How dare you pass me about like a swaddled babe? I shall return and tell them myself.
It makes a lot of the already pretentious Squeenixisms come across as completely insufferable and eye-rolling. That's not to say that there's no surprises to come along in the story, but it's a pretty hard sell if you're not immediately invested. I was given this game through Steam, and as a warning to those playing through Steam, there is this odd occasional crashing issue when attempting to bring up the Shift Tab interface. I was forced to restart the game several times as the product key kept appearing on the screen while I was playing. It didn't seem to happen to everyone, but be wary of this. Starting out, you can create your character with a seemingly complex, but actually fairly simplistic character creator. For the most part, you just have a lot of options, and while the entire color palette is pretty much open to you, you'll notice that there's a lack of options involving your facial features, faces, and hairstyles. No joke, the Mikote have several hairstyles that are literally the exact same style with a different color hairband. The only available sliders are for your height, which actually tells you your character's actual height in inches, a muscle tone slider for a few races, and of course for females the breast slider, which for the most part isn't as over the top as it is in most games. Still, the fact that this option exists on the Lalafell, regardless of how little of a difference it makes, is just ugh. The game isn't entirely beneath jiggle physics despite their subtlety, and the game does manage to find other uses for such an engine. You can even choose a character birthday and a patron deity that has a slight effect on your elemental stats. Races are as follows, starting with the human analog, the Hure, and featuring city-dwelling Midlanders and the mountain and warrior-focused Highlanders. Next up are the Elezen, the elven analog, featuring the forest-dwelling Wildwood and the cave-dwelling Duskwhite. After that is the race that I cannot take seriously in the slightest, the diminutive Lalafell. Somewhat like a gnome analog, they look like squat toddlers, and every time a cutscene features them in a serious situation, like when one barges into the Adventurers Guild with its bodyguards and starts beating up on a deadbeat who didn't pay him, I couldn't help but feel like I was watching a preschool play version of Breaking Bad. They are a very popular race in the game, however, and contain the Plainsfolk and Dunefolk race options. Next up, the cat people race, the Mikote. They're extremely popular among the Kawaii Desu Sugoi Time Lucky Fun Explosion player base. Originally a female-only race, the revamp introduced a male version. The two race options are the Seekers of the Sun and the Keepers of the Moon. Finally, the Rogadin, the hulking giant race. Race options include the Seawolves and the Hellguard. These were originally a male-only race until Realm Reborn created female versions of the race. Noticing something familiar, Final Fantasy XI fans? Yeah, these are practically the exact same races as the choices available in Final Fantasy XI. The Hyur are the Hume, the Elezen are the Elvon, the Lalafell are the Taru Taru, the Mikote are the Mithra, and the Rogadin are the Galka. They just made the latter three races look far less hairy and animalistic than they did in 11. In fact, the cat and giant race still have their male and female exclusivity in 11. It's just another point making me wonder why they made another MMO. Starting out, you can choose your class, not to be confused with your job, which we'll get into in a bit. There are two class types available, the physical Disciples of War and the spell-focused Disciples of Magic. Within the Disciples of War, you can choose to be the Gladiator, a sword and board defensive class, the Marauder, who wields great axes and is also capable of tanking, the Pugilist, who fights with knuckle and fist weaponry, the Lancer, who uses pole arms, the Archer for ranged physical damage, and the Rogue for dual-wielded knife attacks. Far less options exist in the Disciples of Magic, consisting only of the Conjurer, the Healer, the Thaumaturge, an elemental spellcaster, and an Arcanist, the pet summoning class. I tell you this in plain English because the game does not. Descriptions on the character page are overly flowery and don't ever outright state what they do. Nothing about the description or name Thaumaturge evokes the image of a damage mage, given the other options. In fact, one of the definitions of Thaumaturge is Miracle Worker, and was used by several saints, making it sound more fitting for a white mage than a black mage. In fact, Conjurer sounds more like the Summoner, and Arcanist sounds more like a black mage. But nope, that's not how it works. It's a personal nitpick, pointless gripe of mine, and I'll just let it go and move on. Of course, each of these classes break off into a job at level 30, and I'll get into the hows of that much later on. One thing I have to state outright, as I was warned about this myself, this game starts out very, very slow. I don't just mean the tutorial, I mean you'll be well into level 20 or 30 and still have the game throw tutorial tips your way, introducing you to mechanics that you'll likely have figured out on your own if you've played any other world MMO. The whole thing comes across as insultingly hand-holding, and might immediately frustrate MMO veterans who have grasped the concept of dungeons, party balance, roles, and other world MMO basics ages ago. Throw upon this a few dozen wordy NPCs and slow-paced, occasionally unskippable cutscenes, and I've known many a player who've just tossed their hands up in frustration, wondering why they're paying $15 a month to perform the MMO equivalent of learning to walk. Granted, this is presented in a manner that shows it's trying to get as many new players into the game as possible. And judging by the amount of players who, as some MMO vets might say, stand in the bad or run around in circles instead of letting the tank pull the enemies off of them, I have a feeling that first MMO syndrome is a very literal term for a lot of these players. This makes the game a great experience for newcomers to MMOs, and is a lot more welcoming than Final Fantasy XI ever was, but it's absurdly frustrating to more experienced MMO players. I cursed this pacing out in frustration on many occasions. I can't speak about how this combat was improved from 1.0, but I can tell you how it works. It's still mostly basic target-and-click combat, and depending on your class and its playstyle, will depend on how much you're permitted to move about while in combat. Thaumaturges are practically turrets, but most Disciples of War can jump about to their heart's content, including the archers. Like some recent MMOs such as The Secret World, Guild Wars 2, and WildStar, there's telegraphed attacks that radiate out from the enemy, like forward cones, targeted AoE, or personal AoE attacks. The Moorball's iconic Bad Breath attack is one of these moves. The telegraphs themselves come across as a bit broken or overly affected by lag. There's been plenty of times that I was out of the field before the attack was cast, and still ended up somehow getting hit by it. It's understood that if you're in the field when the telegraph is finished, even if you move out of range before the animation plays, you'll still be hit. I'd much prefer if the field remained visible throughout the attack animation, but it's the fact that it vanishes before casting that takes some getting used to. Classes of interesting mechanics you'll have to grasp to play effectively, like the Thaumaturge's Astral Fire and Umbral Ice buffs, causing you to have to choose from near infinitely sustained mana or burning through it quickly to do a ton more damage. Oh, and to Final Fantasy fans and that one absurd Twitter troll, there is no sense of elemental damage in this game. You can cast fire spells on Ifrit to the same effect they would have on anything else, which just feels weird if you're used to the other games in the series. The death penalty is fairly lax in the game, not that Final Fantasy XI brand of losing experience. In this game, you simply take a hit to your gear durability, and you're forced to revive at your home point if no one is around to resurrect you. If you do get res though, you'll suffer a minor debuff for a minute or so. This penalty only applies once you reach level 10. The loot system in this game is automatic, and thankfully, backspace is not only plentiful, but the game rarely dumps so many items on you that you'll run out of space anytime soon. In fact, most armor drops are placed into a separate inventory due to the multi-classing system of this game. Quest items also get their own backspace. Once you hit level 10 and gain the ability to multi-class, you can even save gear sets to swap between at any time. The quest system in the game is pretty standard. They're usually multi-tiered, meaning that just because you collected the 5 pelts that the NPC asked for doesn't mean that you're getting the rewards just yet. The 2 types of quests are the main story quests, marked with a fire-shaped border, and the side quests marked with a golden Q. Note that when an NPC specifically asks you for items, you'll need to hand them over in a system that'll open your inventory and force you to place the item in a window that'll appear next to it. I have a love-hate relationship with the handover system, as there's this air of tedium about it, adding an extra step that's something most MMOs would just remove from your inventory automatically. However, it definitely helped my immersion experience and kept me on my toes, so I never ended up on MMO autopilot as I have done in so many other games before. Adding to the immersion factor that some people might find convoluted are the quests that you're instructed to perform a specific emote or type something in the chat block to activate the next step in the quest. It's not very common among MMOs, and only in the secret world have I seen this used as a mechanic. However, in Final Fantasy XIV, the fact that the chat logs specifically say you need to /poke something rather than just presenting it in a less immersion-breaking manner takes some of the fun out of the mechanic. Speaking of broken immersion, who translated this game? Seriously, I want to know, because this is some of the most insufferable writing I've seen. Coming across as faux medieval and using archaic terms and uses of words like prey and the ever-present mayhap. They use it so often that it comes across as a joke, ignoring basic writing principles of using the same word over and over. And when that word is something as unused as mayhap, it sticks out even further. They are aware that both maybe and perhaps are viable words they could have put in on occasion, right? Instead, it's a big steaming bowl of pretension, like that person you know who ends most of their sentences with per se. Quest titles also contain that Terra-level BS of making innuendos, horrible puns, or internet memes. Things like a quest to obtain raw ore called Give It To Me Raw. The quest to unlock Ifrit hard mode is called Ifrit Bleeds We Can Kill It. I was looking at a distant dynamic event featuring a massive crab, made the stupid giant enemy crab reference over raid call, and then subsequently screamed obscenities at the screen when I saw the event was literally called Giant Enemy Crab. Hell, there's a part in the main story where a Lalafell bard actually sings Troll-a-lol-a-lo. I mean, they were aware they were localizing a Final Fantasy game, right? The game has its own memes, history, and lore. There's no need for this kinda localized Korean MMO, I don't care about the story, let's put whatever in here brand of crap. This feels more like amateur Shakespeare night at the local frat house. I seem to be in the minority here, as plenty of people find this sort of thing amusing, but I know I'm not alone, so yeah, be prepared for this. Those dynamic events I keep talking about are called fates in this game, but they operate nearly exactly like they do in Guild Wars 2. You're either killing a boss creature, fighting off enemy waves, protecting a point, escorting a character, or collecting items. What differentiates fates from the Guild Wars 2 dynamic event system is that you can voluntarily join these by level matching yourself if you're over-leveled by 6. If you are over-leveled and don't auto-sync your level, the game won't even let you attack anything in the fate. I'll talk more about auto-level syncing in Community. Another good way to get experience is to follow your class's hunting logs, which will grant you major experience bonuses upon finding and killing a set number of enemies across the map. If you come across a creature with an odd wisp symbol above it, it's a creature featured in your log, and once hunted to completion, that symbol will no longer appear above that enemy, and you'll get a massive experience bonus. As you progress in the story, you'll find solo-only mini-instance dungeons called duty quests, which act as a story-based gear and skill check before you can advance. They aren't usually too complex, but when you're forced to keep an NPC alive when it has the survival instincts of a drunken cliff diver, you might get plenty of unfair failure notices and have to start over. Death or failure in duty quest merely restarts the mission, and you gain a buff to your health and damage with each failure, stacking up to 5 times. Getting around Eorzea can be made simpler by the various fast travel systems in the game. First up is the Ethernet, a fast travel teleport system using crystals scattered around major towns and some smaller villages. When you find the Aetheryte crystal, right-click it to attune yourself with it. After this, you can use it as a home point when you die, or a teleport point for a fee. Major towns also have smaller Aethernet crystals that can instantly port you to various sections of the city for free. Next up are chocobo porters, unlocked at level 10. With a porter, you can either take a ride on an automatic chocobo for a small fee of gil, or rent a chocobo for a larger fee. Both are immediately dismissed when you dismount them. Finally, airships will port you between the major towns, but once you've found the ether shard in each major town, there's absolutely no reason to use these unless you're just seriously pinching pennies with your gil. Another bonus of reaching level 10 is the ability to take advantage of the class change system. Throughout each major town are the various guilds. The word guild in this game is used in the traditional medieval sense. They're groups of NPCs who train others in a form of combat or trade. Yes, this is also tied to the crafting system, but more on that in a bit. Not only is this system allowing you to play all forms of classes as one character, but it's an actual mechanic in the game to unlock the more lucrative jobs, the traditional Final Fantasy classes. Upon level 30, you'll get that opportunity. Thaumaturges can become black mages, pugilists can become monks, lancers can become dragoons, archers can become bards for some reason. In order to unlock these jobs, you'll need to reach level 15 with another class. For a gladiator to become a paladin, they must have 15 levels in the healing class conjurer. Makes sense. For a thaumaturge to become a black mage, they need to reach level 15 as an archer. Makes less sense. As of now, only one class has an option when choosing a job, the Arcanist, who can become either the DPS job Summoner or the healing job Scholar. Like a lot of the features in this game, not only are they level locked, but some features require you to reach a certain point in the story quest as well. Even a recent patch added on the requirement that you must reach the level 20 story quest Self-Management before you can undertake a job quest. Once you've unlocked the job, you can switch to a new job by equipping the item you get. You'll continue to get experience in your main class even after you upgrade to a job, so unlike switching classes, you won't have to start over at level 1. If you're interested in the crafting system, that ties in directly with a class change system. There are two groups for crafting. Item creation is done with the Disciples of the Hand, while gathering classes are under Disciples of the Land. Gathering classes are the Miner, Botanist, and Fisher. Crafting classes are numerous, including weavers, goldsmiths, carpenters, blacksmiths, and the like. Crafting is kind of a pain in the ass. The Weaver Guildmaster even welcomes you to the craft by asking you if you're prepared to suffer. Promising, isn't it? When crafting, you have to open your crafting log by hitting N, create the item by hitting Synthesize as long as you have the appropriate items and elemental crystals. Then you use your abilities to craft the item. It's like a mini-game involving status bars, and while intuitive, it's a pain when you're creating simple crafting components. After level 10 in a crafting profession, you'll unlock the Quick Synthesis option, which is a relative term, as you still create the items individually and have a chance for failures that likely would not have happened if you made the item manually. Gathering classes, however, are a bit more simple to use. An interesting twist, especially on botany, is when you find a node, you can actually choose from a list of possible items to gain from it, some with a more likely chance to obtain than others. Many don't seem to bother with the crafting unless they're just into the idea of crafting in general. There's plenty of good stuff to make, but you'll need a lot of gil and a lot of time to work your way to that level. It might be better to wait until you've had a good amount of time in a combat class before you make that switch. It might be a bit disheartening to hear you're getting knocked down to level 1 when changing classes, but the game has plenty of systems to get you leveled back up in a decent amount of time. Beyond the ever-recurring Fate events and a massive side quests, you can find and unlock various Lev quests, also known as Guild Levs. Find a Guild Lev NPC, known as a Levmet, and you can select from a list of recurring quests of a specific level. When starting a Guild Lev, you can also boost the level recommended to increase the rewards. You have a finite amount of Lev quests that you can do, which slowly regenerate every 12 hours, and you can save up quite a few of them. It's suggested that you avoid taking Guild Levs when you have story and side quests at your level, and save them for when you want to power through the secondary class required for unlocking your job upgrade. I will recommend unlocking Guild Levs as you find them in new towns whenever you come across them, since they're almost like doing double quests, and you get rewarded for both the Guild Lev and the quest that's asking you to unlock it. In a portion of the story that will tie in later with PvP, you'll be asked to join a grand company and choose from the Flames, the Storm, or the Serpent. Each is based in the 3 main towns, and it really just depends on which one you prefer. Quests you'll gain from your grand company are identical, and this will only choose which team you choose to PvP with, so if you want to be on the same team as your friend, make sure you join their grand company. This is also when you'll unlock the grand company ticket system and earn your chocobo mount, which can later serve as a combat pet. If looking for some space to yourself, you can head into an inn room once you unlock it, where you can access your armoire, log out, or exit the game with the bed. You can even watch cutscenes you've unlocked. You can also access your retainer NPC and the beauty shop NPC from this room. In the inn room or most any town with an aetheryte shard, you'll gain rested XP when logged out. Man, after I found out the truth about rested XP, my mind was blown. Oh, you don't know the truth about rested XP? They mentioned it on an episode of Extra Credits, but if you're curious, I'll write up a whole thing about it on MMOGrinder.net. It'll change the way you think. Seriously. The retainers I spoke of are creatable NPCs who act as storage, selling, as well as later can be sent on ventures to obtain items for you. They can be summoned with any summoning bell that you find, and you can have up to 2 of them. One piece of advice I got before starting utterly baffled me. Don't do all the quests you find. After playing this, I get it. There's a few times where the quests send you in 2 opposing directions, and with similar level quests in both places, there's no reason to travel around doing all of them. As a tip, stick with the main story quests until you're forced to reach a certain level to continue. The only problem with this method is that you end up possibly missing some of the unlocked content, and almost everything you unlock, including some dungeons, requires you to find and perform a quest first. Sure, there are plenty of other ways to level, but you don't want to be stuck waiting around for your level allotment to refill, or fates to respawn either. On the plus side, if you manage to get a class to 50, you'll get a character-wide experience boost for every new class you attempt. As you probably guessed by now, I didn't get to level 50. This isn't news to anyone who watches this show regularly, as I rarely to never reach endgame before reviewing. But it's worth noting the sheer amount of things that are unlocked upon reaching level 50 is just staggering. It's almost set up like every level before level 50 is preparing you for the max level. Sure, I didn't go into things like atma grinding, hard mode dungeons, primals and the like, but for most part you're not going to come across these anytime soon either. It's interesting that there's always something being unlocked as you play. But at the same time, it's frustrating hearing how much fun your friends are having with the end-level content, while you're forced to participate in things that aren't all that impressive when you're starting out. Tell you what, I just put in for 60 more days of game time. If I manage to reach level 50 and experience some of this endgame content, I'll do a backtrack episode covering my experiences with it. Otherwise, as a new player, expect to be feeling left in the dust for a good while unless you're really enamored with this game. In-game, the community of FF14 isn't even remotely terrible. There are certainly bad apples, and players with serious first MMO problems who can't grasp the basics, but for the most part, people are generally quiet and helpful. There's little concern about having your mob stolen. The respawn rate is fairly quick, although occasionally a bit too much to handle if you're solo. The game runs on a kinda hybrid of the tagging system and giving anyone who fights the reward. First person to tag an enemy will get all the rewarded XP, but if anyone contributes enough, they can get credit for the kill as well. Since I mentioned that guilds aren't guilds in this game, the thing that MMO players might refer to as a guild is called a free company. It's simple enough to create one, and you can choose both a name and an abbreviation to display next to your character's name. Free companies also have their own properties in the residential area called the Mist. If you're not starting or joining a free company, expect to have a slight onslaught of invite spam. The guild-like system from Final Fantasy XIV, link shells, are back. They're like chat channels with a hierarchy, and it's very easy to create one. You can join multiple link shells, but only one free company. Joining up in parties in this game works in multiples of 4. 4 players for a light party, 8 players for a full party, and 24 for a raid. As a new player, you won't be seeing anything but light parties, as the early dungeons and events are all 4-player instances. One of these grouped instance events is called Guild Hests, not to be confused with Guild Levs. Guild Hest, Guild Lev, Ilm, and Yalm? What's up with Squeenix and their incessant need to make up words for things that already exist? Guild Hests are miniature instances, and just like dungeons, can be joined to the Duty Finder by pressing the U key. Guild Hests in many ways act as training modes for dungeons and harder mechanics, but will feel somewhat tiresome to MMO veterans, like those who would already understand mechanics like group pulls, avoiding damage zones, prioritizing targets, and what have you. Even if I have seen plenty of players, even in the later level Guild Hests, failing to follow basic instructions of the place. I'm not entirely sure they're serving their true purpose is all. Unlike Guild Levs, Guild Hests and dungeons can be entered as many times as you like. Another form of instance content are the highly entertaining trials, in which you fight against an iconic Final Fantasy summon monster called primals in this game, in a mechanics-heavy multi-tiered fight. However, as a new player, it's unlikely you'll get to see the full effect of any of these anytime soon, as you fight your first primal, Ifrit, at level 20 once reaching that portion of the story. The next primal isn't seen until level 34, the far more challenging rock golem Titan. Past that is Garuda at level 44, and 50 is when most of these fights will actually unlock. In all dungeons, there's a limit break mechanic that builds as your party does damage, and depending on if you fill up 1 bar or 2, any member of the party can use it to differing effects depending on their role. I didn't find players using it too often early on, but I can imagine that these end up as major lifesavers in the later encounters. There's a major plus and minus to the level matching system in this game. For example, when completing a duty roulette, even at level 40, you can still end up in a level 15 dungeon. And if you swapped out all your old spells for fancy new ones, you'll notice that half of them are now unusable because technically you didn't have them at level 15. It brings a sense of fairness to the system, but it can be a pain. It might be a good idea to have a secondary noob skill bar set up with your earlier spell sets to better prepare for this issue. The mechanic of fairness also ties in with the guild lev and fate system, as if you see a character on a guild lev or in a fate that you haven't level synced to, you'll be physically unable to attack the enemies that they're fighting. The same goes in reverse, and of course the other players can't attack enemies assigned to your guild lev unless they're in your party. The PvP, so far, doesn't really feel entirely necessary. Only at level 30 will you get your first chance to try it out, and it's a 4v4 arena battle, level synced to 30. It didn't seem like the most lucrative thing to do, but it's an alternative to playing quests and levs all day if you're into that sort of thing. Interestingly, your character will also get a set of PvP-only skills, and certain PvE skills will have a far lesser effect when used in PvP. It's a much better system than the one used in World of Warcraft, where arenas caused so much balance strife in the Burning Crusade days that skills or entire classes would get nerfed because of their overpoweredness in PvP, but effectively ruining them in PvE and raids, rather than just separating how those skills work in each mode. Kudos to Square for figuring that one out. Gold spammers, like all MMOs, are somewhat rampant in this game. You won't go more than an hour without receiving a whisper from someone with a jumble of letters for a name. My blacklist is swarming with names because of this, and the report gold seller option doesn't seem to exist, at least I never found one. There may even come a time where you can't blacklist the spammer because they've sent you a friend request as well. If this happens, check your friend request and deny the one from the spammer, then you can block them as normal. Disturbingly, there were quite a few times where the gold spam came from players with perfectly viable sounding names, making me think that the spammers are heavily stealing player accounts as well. If you plan on sticking with a game, you might want to try your best to add as many security options as possible. There's the auto-translator option that carries over from Final Fantasy XI, where you can choose from a set of phrases that'll automatically display in another player's chosen language. Considering this game is a host of regional servers, it doesn't make as much sense, but you can occasionally get grouped up with players from other servers. So if someone doesn't seem to understand your instructions, you can try to communicate with them this way, just in case they don't speak your language. Otherwise, it's possible they just plain suck. To access the auto-translated phrases, press Tab after opening the chat block. Player names in this game range in their creativity. The lore of the game is strict and logical reasoning for each race's name, but that sure doesn't stop people from trying to create characters like Tifei Lockhart and Cloud's Trife. It's not as common as you'd expect, though. One thing I'd noticed is the naming convention for the Rogadin, most often seen in the town Limsa Laminsa, had this almost Welsh naming convention where the characters' names are a mashed blend of consonants. No joke, there was at least 3 times I tried to blacklist and report an NPC for having a name that looked like they fell over onto their keyboard because I was convinced they were a bot. At this point, Square should just come full circle and name one of its NPCs XX Sephiroth 1990XX. Finally, despite the fact that I didn't personally experience this, there's apparently a subset of players who are very much into the fashion armor aspect of the game that's unlocked at level 50, going so far as trying to create their characters to resemble popular characters from various forms of media. While I haven't seen this myself, I'd rather like to, as I'd like to ask them for creative tips sometime. I'm tired of Cyan looking like a pink-haired girl in a brown burlap muumuu. As I mentioned before, and of course the fact that this is a special episode and not a numbered one, Final Fantasy XIV is not free in the least. You'll need to purchase the game itself, which comes with 30 days of free subscription, and then subscribe to the game. If you're concerned about letting Square bill you monthly with a credit card, you can purchase a physical or digital 60-day time card for $30 a pop. There's no Plex or Cred-style system in this game to let players purchase tradable time in the game, so you will have to pay for it. Something common to subscription is the option for paid services, like server transfers, which, to be honest, most free-to-play games won't offer, as well as renaming your character and redesigning them from scratch, changing them to a different race or gender if you wish. Prices of these seem to fall close to the WoW model. Character retools and name changes cost $10, but retools can be purchased in packs for a slight savings. Server transfers cost $18, down from the far more usual $25. Like a few MMOs before it, namely City of Heroes and the Secret World, Final Fantasy XIV offers rewards for being subscribed. Unlike the Secret World, you're rewarded for how many days you've purchased, not just being actively subscribed. So if you buy a 60-day time card, you'll get a 30 and 60-day veteran reward immediately. These range from cosmetic pets and alternate outfits to alternate mounts and even free character retools. Currently, the rewards stop at 540 days of subscription, but they promise to add more in the future updates. Hell, the Realm Reborn version of this game isn't even 540 days old. If you want to protect your account, you can purchase a keyring that will generate a security code for $10. Alternately, if you have a smartphone, you can download an app to generate that passcode for free. One common complaint I always hear is when subscription games end up getting a cash shop, and yes, Final Fantasy XIV has one. They gave flack to the Secret World for it, and that was before it ever went buy to play. Guys, this is seriously nothing new. WoW has been doing it for well over half a decade, and yes, people were complaining then. Of course, these items, as stated with the previous games, are entirely cosmetic. They're mostly mount skins and costume options. Currently, Final Fantasy's cash shop is selling the Sleipnir mount, some pet versions of story NPCs, and the Halloween items from last year. If you want them, fine. If you don't want them, it's no problem. If you want to have them but you don't want to pay for them, you can't have it both ways. My argument about subscription pedigree in WildStar fell on a ton of deaf ears. I wasn't lambasting the model as much as the risk. A game like Final Fantasy has a pedigree behind it, not only as a franchise, but a subscription MMO as well, so people were far more likely to take that risk with this game. Sure, it didn't pay off initially, but there's plenty of people willing to plop down the money for this game, and as much as I know people would like to see this game go free to play, I honestly can't see how they could do it without gutting the core of this game. Am I saying the subscription is worth it? That's entirely up to you. I was all about ready to let this one lapse, but I stuck with it long enough to give a chance to grow on me. If anything, there's a trial you can download that'll give you a good idea of how the game plays. If you're not sold on the game by the time your trial is over, or you hit the trial level cap of 20, you're probably not going to want to fully invest in it. It does get better, but that's not always an excuse that's going to work on people. I was deathly afraid to look at this game, and while I await the inevitable aftermath from those mad I didn't talk about the materia system and the relic weapons, or mocking my pronunciation of various Squeenixisms, or pointing out one of the details I will have inevitably screwed up, my actual experience in the game was a tumultuous one. I started out somewhat bored, became increasingly frustrated with the hand-holding and the overall simplistic fights and dungeons, and generally badly written dialogue early in the game, all of which came to a head with the Company of Heroes questline, which was literally the same scenario you had to complete multiple times in different locations with different NPCs. However, getting past that point, something clicked. I actually wanted to start playing, and I had a lot more fun in group runs than I was simply just trying to solo the game. However, this is unquestionably a slow-starting game, and while I will never advise someone to just keep playing a game they don't enjoy until they start having fun with it, be known that the things in the game do improve. It just depends if you want to invest in that or not. Here's my final rating. Had this been the game that Final Fantasy XI was when I first played it, I could easily imagine being just as obsessed with it as other players seem to be. It's wonderfully accessible to MMO beginners, offering gamepad support and very simple mechanics that are slowly introduced to you over a period of time. The game's visuals and music are top-notch, making this one of the most polished and fantastic-looking games in the genre to date. It's definitely something to be impressed with, especially considering how well the game runs for it. The player base in-game is a solid group of people, and yes, while you're going to find a handful of jerks, most players are pretty helpful, or at the very least, respectfully quiet. Whether that changes once you start pugging endgame raids is beyond me, but at least while you're starting out and learning the ropes, it's not overly likely that someone's going to jump down your throat for minor mistakes. You a Final Fantasy fan? You wish Final Fantasy was actually fantasy again? This game might be your ticket to that world. Despite some odd decisions in localization, this game is chock full of Final Fantasy fan service, from the music stings to the familiar enemies, and even the random elements named from other games. You'll see Magitech armors from 6, materia from 7, and music from throughout the entire series. This game was almost tailor-made to get your inner Final fanboy to react nostalgically. You want to play, you need to pay. Simple as that. There's no system in place to let you buy time with in-game cash, so either fork over the cash for time cards or tack on a credit card. Of course, if you want to go even further into the game's paid services, remember to stop by the cash shop if you really need to be riding on Odin's horse. Despite this game's flash and polish, there's very little in this game that you wouldn't have seen 100 times over in most other world MMOs. It still uses the tank healer DPS trinity. It's target and click combat. You do quests and you find dungeons to improve your gear and levels. Things like lev quests, hunting logs, and guild hests have existed in other MMOs with far more understandable names, so there isn't much more than the Final Fantasy fan service to set this one apart. If you're looking for another MMO to break the mold, this very much will not be that one, so MMO veterans might grow tired fast. The same can be said about the game's pacing, that while fantastic for beginners, is almost insulting to those who have the basic concept of a world MMO down. The simplest things tend to get over-explained, while more unique features are under-explained. The game holds your hand all the way to level 30, and even some of the later boss mechanics aren't all that hard to grasp if you're familiar with the genre. If you prefer the feeling of Final Fantasy XI with its far more punishing systems and complex mechanics, 14 might just feel like a step towards casualization for you, so some veterans of that game will likely not have much reason to switch over. 11 is still going very strong, and with a cheaper subscription cost, so unless you plan to play all the things Final Fantasy, you likely won't need to make the switch. Finally, this is a paid-only title. Subscription models, regardless of what you think of the model or the games they're featured on, are still a barrier for a lot of people, whether they can afford it or they're just unwilling to pay. Unless you have a friend to buy the game and toss you some time cards, if you don't pay, you won't have much of a choice when your trial expires. Next time, I'll be giving a look at a game that I ended up passing over, despite being entirely prepared to look at it. But from what I've heard, it didn't really fit that theme anyway.
Jen, didn't you just leave this morning? Yes, I forgot my pants.
I look like I forgot my pants with this outfit. Honey, where are my pants?
Where's my super suit?
Did you see Honey Where's My Pants last night?
The fair part is when Wildstyle comes barging in. It's like, where's my pants? Found your pants. Series over.